My topic for today is science journalism, or maybe I should say science journalists, or maybe I should even say scientific journalists, for the two particular specimens that I'm going to talk about were early British science journalists, and they tended to call their profession scientific journalism. A bit of an odd term, but I hope to make clear what they precisely meant with it. Now, writing about science for a general audience, of course, is nothing new in the period that we were talking about. It goes way back. For example, if you think about all the public periodicals that went around in 18th century France, a lot of which were filled, certainly toward the end of the century, with all kinds of scientific spectacles that people were interested in. There was a lot of reporting on scientific discoveries and scientific phenomena and public experiments in late 18th century France. Think of the electricity experiments, the performed chemistry experiments by Ruel and the Jardin des Plantes, the famous balloon flights of the Montgolfier brothers, etc., etc. So these things featured in the popular press, and there's nothing so special about, so new about this thing recurring in the early 20th century. But of course, for science journalists to become a profession, to have a specific job in which it is your daily task to report on science, that is really something new in the 20th century. Now I'm going to refrain from making any sort of generalizing remarks, even about Europe, because I feel we're on thin ice there if you try to do that. But if you look at the western parts of Europe that I know a little bit better, I think really you don't see any specific science journalist appear before the late 1920s. In the United States, the journalist Waldemar Kempfert, incidentally a nephew of Otto Neurath, is appointed as science journalist by the New York Times in 1927. He might be probably the first one there. In 1928, the Manchester Guardian, what today is the Guardian, appoints James Gerald Crowther as its scientific journalist. And 2 years later, Richie Calder, a Scottish journalist, is appointed as the science journalist for the Daily Herald in Britain. And at least in the Anglophone world, these are the first appointments like that. Not so long after that, in the United States, a National Association of Science Writers is established in 1934, so that bears testimony to the fact that there was already a little population that sought to take care of its own interests. But I want to focus here on the British case and on these particular two British individuals, J.G. Crowther, as he was known, and also a little bit Richie Calder. Because not only were they science journalists, they were communists, or at least sympathizers with the communist cause, and at least that you could call them as fellow travelers. They saw the Soviet Union as a model society to be followed. Now, it would be very easy, and this has actually been done by a number of scholars, to tell this story as a story of professionalization, right? Where you have people that write about science on an amateur's basis, on a non-specialist basis first, and then slowly the business is turned into an official and formalized profession. But my argument will be that such a story would really completely miss the point of what is going on here. And such stories have actually been written, and I think they do miss the point. Because people like Crowther and Calder, the guys I'm going to talk about, were not just science journalists who also happened to have communist sympathies, whose communism was sort of accidental to the job. No, it was central to them. They were first and foremost communists or fellow travelers who decided to create science journalism as a means to further their cause. So that the profession of science journalism wasn't automatically established and then some communists happened to be in it. No, it was a project of these people to establish such a profession so as to further the communist cause in Britain and maybe beyond. So that was what I will try to show, that a British sort of communism, Soviet style, was behind the creation of the profession of science journalism. Now I hope to show this in this talk. It's up to you whether I succeed in convincing you. I will do so by briefly walk through the careers of these two individuals, J.G. Crowther and Richie Calder, look at the various influences, and during the process try to analyze what is the particular conception of journalism and what is the conception of science. And then in the end I will ask the question, that's why the question mark is there, to what extent is a sort of epistemology that informed their activities Soviet-based? I have my doubts there, but they did not. They very much believed so. Alright, let me start with the most important of the two that I'm going to talk about tomorrow morning. James Gerald Crowther. You see a picture of him. There's not many pictures of him. He was, strangely enough for a journalist, a kind of shy person who didn't like to be much in the public eye, but he was very much an organizer of public events. But not so initially. He was born in Halifax in Yorkshire in 1899 to a middle class, lower middle class family. In his high school he won a so-called exhibition, meaning a grant to be able to go study physics at Cambridge. So he went there during the times of the First World War. He spent a little bit of time doing war work for A.V. Hill, a scientist, and that was really what inspired him, much more than Cambridge physics. And within a year in Cambridge he drops out and decides not to finish and leave academia altogether. Then follow a few very uncertain years in which he works various odd jobs, teaching here and there at schools. He gets a job at some point at Oxford University Press, editing their scientific publications. He starts to write for newspapers. At the same time, or even a little bit later, a little bit after that, he has already developed his communist sympathies, and he joins the Communist Party of Great Britain already in 1923. So in subsequent years he develops his taste for science journalism, starts to write also for the Manchester Guardian, and in 1928, somewhat famously, approaches the Guardian's editor C.P. Scott and tells him that he wants to become a science journalist, scientific journalist, and could he please employ him as such. To which Scott allegedly answered, "The trouble is, Mr. Crowther, there isn't such a profession." So then Crowther tells him, "Well, you better create one then, and I will fill the post." And actually, Scott takes the risk, and he does so. And from that moment on, Crowther starts to write for the Manchester Guardian on a daily basis. What exactly did he do as a science journalist? Well, his first and foremost task, and the same was true for Richie Calder, who we'll see later, was to report scientific news. They had to fill their columns every day. So they had to report on new discoveries and new findings and breakthroughs, etc. So they were very close to the various scientific communities in Britain, and for Crowther also abroad, following what's going on, having strong personal relationships with them, and being able to be there when things happen. So, for example, in 1933, when the atom is split, when is that again? 32, right. At the Cavendish laboratory in Cambridge, Crowther received a phone call beforehand, come over and see, so you can report on this event. Now, he's actually in Denmark at that time with Niels Bohr, so he said, "Why don't you call Calder?" So his buddy Calder goes there and reports on the event. So it's that sort of active journalism of reporting the news that they very much do. But that's not really the aim of what they do, certainly not for Crowder. His aim is not just to report scientific news of discoveries, etc., but what he really wants to convey to the reader is what he calls the spirit of science. The mental attitude of the researcher, that's a quote. Another quote, the revolutionary heart and brilliant intellect of Heisenberg and Dirac. Right? So he wants to convey the sort of mindset that researchers bring to the job, and impress his readers with that as something perhaps to be emulated. Because thirdly, on top of science reporting and conveying this attitude, what Crowther thinks he needs to do is really to breed a scientific attitude among his reading public. So he doesn't just want to report the news and tell people something, inform them. He wants to change them. He wants to make people think scientifically. They should be impressed by the sharp analyses that scientists make with their sharp analytical ways, so that readers themselves can start to emulate it and think scientifically for themselves. In 1938, Crowder wrote a book, this slide, The Outline of the Universe. It's a 2-volume Pelican pocket, very much a product of popularization. If you leaf through it, you'll think nothing much of it. It's just an outline of the universe, as it says, full of astronomical scientific information. But the point of the book, as Crowder makes clear in the preface, is a very specific one. Because there he writes, if the universe is viewed clearly, by its readers he means, if the universe is viewed clearly, society may be viewed clearly, and its insanities may be seen and removed. So what we see here is actually an exercise in public education of a way of thinking that astronomers have, that Crowder wants his readers to apply to society so they can see sharply how it functions and how that functioning could be improved. Or, he puts it more negatively, how its insanities may be taken away. Well, what sort of insanities are they? Well, I think it's a pretty easy guess by now. Crowder, of course, feels that living in a capitalist society, there's a lot wrong with the way things are arranged. And if you only would apply the scientific viewpoint to this, you would see that and know what to change and perhaps how to change it. Crowder took this particular task of making people think scientifically to a broad range of endeavors. In 1943, so jump a little bit in time, he and Kohler and a few people of the British Association for the Advancement of Science organized, in the midst of the war, a great conference called Science and the Citizen, the Public Understanding of Science, which was exactly about the subject that the title says. But if you look at the different talks given during this conference, they are very much about public instruction. The dominant metaphor during the conference is that of radio, of a radio transmitter sending out a message that the audience should receive. There's no back and forth, there's no return, right? The metaphor is not a telephone where you can talk back. It's the radio. And actually Crowder says, typifies this as such. Radio, he says, is in some ways the most powerful instrument ever put in the hands of man. With it, the same idea may be put simultaneously into everybody's head. So his conception of public instruction is a rather strong one. It's really putting ideas in heads. That's what he wants to do. Not with some sort of evil purpose, but of course he believes that he helps people here by doing this, so that they can see more sharply the world they live in and analyze it and improve it. Right, so what he wants to change about society, I think is clear from his communist point of view. He believes that we live in a capitalist world in which there are all sort of social relations are not at their best. He also believes that science suffers from that science will do much better under a socialist regime, and it will be truly acknowledged for the emancipatory and problem-solving capacity that it embodies. And he wants the world to turn that way. And in order to do so, he believes that scientific thinking will help. So in a sense, this is very much a sort of Marxism as scientific social theory idea, that if you look at the world scientifically, you will understand it in a Marxist way, and you'll try to change it in a Marxist way. That's broadly seen Crowder's agenda over the years. That's what he believes in. So in a sense, his cause of science is project of reporting science and making people think scientifically matches one-on-one with his Marxism, right? It's one and the same thing. You cannot separate it, right? So teaching people how to think scientifically is bringing the communist revolution and changes of society closer. And after that change, if people think scientifically, they will create a communist society around themselves, in which science has a central role as an analytical tool and as a solver of all sorts of social problems. And of course, Crowder believes that this is already going on in the Soviet Union. I'll return to that in a second. So you see that his science journalism, his educational instructive task, and his Marxism are very closely related. And it's therefore that they're as closely related, for example, as with as with J.D. Bernal, who a few years later actually remarks in his Social Function of Science book, that at the end of his analysis of science in society, Bernal comes to the conclusion that, I quote, in its endeavor, science is communism. Right? So for Bernal, these things are not connected, they basically boil down to being one and the same thing. And so, with Crowder, we are not talking about somebody who is reporting about science and does so with some political overtones. Now we see somebody who takes a political project, a Marxist project, which then is manifested in the creation of the profession of science journalism and the particular aims that it has had for him. So I think that's how we should see the launch of scientific journalism as a profession in interwar Britain. Now, I've been focusing on Crowder himself quite a lot, but he was a very influential figure if you follow him through the 1930s and 40s. As already been mentioned a few times, Crowder was instrumental in making the Second International Conference on the History of Science in 1931 in London happen. He was the one who was in contact with the Russians and managed to bring such a large team of Russian scientists and philosophers, etc. over. Crowder generally also became very active in what has become known as the social relations of science movement with Bernal and Needham and Haldane, etc. These are usually the sort of figures that we talk about, Bernal and Needham, that they take the stage, but the stage master, the person making it happen behind the scenes, and who does a lot of the, facilitates a lot of the publishing and the publication strategies, is J.G. Crowder. He's almost always there in the committees, working in the background. He also becomes very active from 1938 on in the British Association's Division for the Social and International Relations of Science, which becomes basically the only active branch of the British Association during the war years, organizing incredibly large and influential conferences on, for example, science and the citizen. There's one in 1941 on science and world order, etc., which also expunges this, express the ideal of a science-driven society and a future, much more technocratic Britain in which science will solve your problems. A planned society, the idea of scientific planning, is very much on everybody's lips there. And this is something that's in which Crowder is probably also instrumental. Crowder also is very important in that he's related to the wartime committee for the Allied Ministers of Education. This is a body of Ministers of Education who come together every so often in London, and out of which grows what becomes UNESCO in 1945. Here we see Crowder talking to the Russian delegate Karavayev, I hope I pronounced that correctly. It was a bit of a sleepy committee until from 1944 on, Joseph Needham becomes very active in it, manages to make its central object the promotion of science for the betterment of the world, especially for the third world, out of which then grows UNESCO, which initially, during its first year, has a very strong science component. It's basically a lot about science, bringing post-war relief and bringing sort of third world uplift. Crowder was instrumental in organizing it. He's also actually been instrumental in sending Joseph Needham to China, where actually Needham builds up a few of these ideas, but I won't go into it. How am I doing time-wise?
10 minutes.
Okay, that's you. 7, okay. Fine, yeah, okay. We're a little bit quicker. It's remarkable how much influence people like Crowder and the social relations of science movement, people like Brunel, how much influence they suddenly get during the war years in Britain, when they are given very high positions. And this is true for scientists who do all sort of planning work, but it's also true for these science journalists who are being mobilized in propaganda campaigns. So Crowder, for example, becomes the leader of the science division of the British Council. Now, the British Council may sound as a bit of a sleepy organ, it's sort of promoting British culture abroad. But in the war years, of course, this has a very distinct propaganda meaning. It means promoting Britain abroad, making it look good in the eyes of whatever public. And science is increasingly playing a role in that. I'll get back to that when I talk about the Cold War. All right. After the war, Crowder actually goes on defending the communist cause, and that makes him a little bit of a fringe figure during the Cold War period. But before that, he was definitely influential. I want to briefly, much more briefly, turn to Richie Kohler, who we see here. Kohler was born in Scotland in 1906. He came to science journalism via journalism. Actually, he embarked on journalism already when he was 15 years old, and he dropped out of school and decided to take a job in the newspaper. He works his way up through several newspapers, and finally ends up at the Daily Herald, a Labour paper, where he becomes their science correspondent. Kohler also becomes very active in the social relations of science movement in various roles that are very comparable to Crowder's, making publicity, making sure that pamphlets get a publisher, get printed, etc., organizing space on the radio, and that sort of thing. It's partly, I think, why we know so much about the social relations of science movement, because its members really get a lot of airplay. They really fill the newspapers. Their pamphlets are widely distributed. They get radio shows, etc., etc. They're very much in the public eye. It's a very successful PR campaign, so to speak. Kohler doesn't do only science journalism. He writes a book called Carry On London, right after the Blitz, where he talks to people in neighborhoods that have been blitzed, so to speak, that have been bombed by the Germans, and how they cope with it. And he writes a book about it. It's basically also meant as sort of internal propaganda to make the British persevere through the initial phase of the war with Germany. Shortly after, in 1941, he writes, here's Carry On London, with a Blitz picture on it. Actually, there's also a hole in the dome of the St. Paul there. One of the bombs went through it. Fortunately, didn't explode. A year later, he writes the book Start Planning Britain Now in 1941, which again is a big campaign for a planned society according to scientific principles. So you can see that the work he does is very much on the par with what Crowder was doing. In 1942, Kohler gets a really important position in that he's appointed to become the director of plans and campaigns of the Political Warfare Executive. Now that's a very vague name for it's basically the British government's foreign propaganda agency. It's a secret organization, but a huge one. It has hundreds of staff. And what they do is write all the propaganda that Britain spreads out abroad, in occupied Europe, in neutral countries, secretly also in the US. They're not supposed to do that, but they do it. They try to massage those populations to make them sympathetic to the British war cause in all sorts of ways. It's a very sophisticated operation, and Kohler lands right at the center of it when he starts to direct plans and campaigns. So he makes the general designs for the different propaganda campaigns. And from the moment he's there, you can see that science starts to occupy an important role in a lot of these campaigns. You can see that, for example, in some of the cartoons, this is one that was dropped from airplanes over the Netherlands. I looked at the Dutch cartoons naturally. Making, through astronomy, making fun of Adolf Hitler. There's a German astronomer here who sees the Aryan race occupying, being suppressed on the planet of Mars. So they need liberation, so the railroad should go to Mars and liberate the oppressed German minorities. And it's sort of mocking Nazi ideology by portraying their science and astronomy as ideologically tainted. a strategy that was very much employed by British science writers. There's another great campaign in Britain called Projections of Britain that precedes D-Day, where the task is create a favorable picture of Britain in occupied France, so that French citizens will actually welcome us rather than see us as the next invader, because the British are really afraid that they will not be very welcoming. So again, what Calder does is design these campaigns, and they're all about science and democracy. Britain should be portrayed as a modern society which is characterized by its democratic nature and by the high level of science and the way science is used to shape society there. So maybe a little bit less stark than in Crowder's case, but also with Calder you see that there's a strong tendency to promote science as the basis for planning and to use science journalism and later propaganda to change people's minds, to make them receptive to a scientifically planned, basically a technocratic society. That's the aim there. And also for him, this is an aim that resonates very well with his socialist beliefs. So the ideal society is one in which problems are just solved in a rational, scientific manner. So a socialist society will be a scientific one at the same time. Okay, so again, to come back to the profession of science journalism, what we see here is not science with a political spin, but a political project with a scientific spin, so to speak. That puts a premium on science. Okay, so I think I've sort of explained now what Crowder and Calder did and what the conceptions of science, of journalism, and what their politics were. I want to briefly go now to the final question, and the question is going to be another question, and I'm going to do that in 1 minute. I hope the 1 is a minute, right? Not a second. So as I said before, both Calder and especially Crowder look at the Soviet Union as their model society. So when they did look at the Soviet Union, what is it exactly that they saw? How did they perceive the Soviet Union? In what way was it their model? Well, Crowder had a pretty good view in the sense that he traveled to the Soviet Union since the mid-1920s every year. He had very good contacts there. He visited a lot of scientific institutions in the Soviet Union. This is a book that he wrote about. He wrote 3 books about Soviet science, actually. And what he was impressed by was how scientific the Soviet Union really was. There was 4 times as much funding for science as in a country like Britain, that science was being used for all sorts of practical issues that in Britain were left to all kinds of political debate and sort of party politics, and the parliament, you know, not getting to do anything about it. He believed in the Soviet Union, all kinds of problems became scientized and solved scientifically. So he also had a great appreciation for science in his new communist society. But what about the ideological side of this sort of scientific politics that he believed in and he thought he copied from the Soviet Union? Well, in this particular book from 1936, Soviet Science, he spends also a small chapter not just to the appreciation of science in the Soviet Union, but to its particular philosophy and ideological dimensions. He talks about dialectics here. And what Crowder here writes is that the Soviet Union is based, of course, on dialectical method, and it has a number of advantages to both science and society. First of all, through dialectic is both a theory of science and a theory of society. You can analyze both with it, so it makes it sort of a unitary philosophy. But according to Crowder, it's also a philosophy that's preferable because it is really readily accepting, it has no trouble with a lot of new developments in science that seem to be troubling philosophers and scientists in Western Europe. For example, the wave-particle duality that is established in the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, Crowder claims is not a problem at all to Soviet scientists, because they are used to live with such dualities, because of their dialectics. For them it's bread and butter, it's something that comes very naturally to them. Also, ideas about evolution and human evolution are very compatible with this dialectic Soviet view. There's no trouble about them at all. And lastly, in the Soviet Union, there's no opposition, but in fact a merger between theory and practice. The theory and practice, academic and applied science, don't fight each other, they work hand in hand. That's what Soviet philosophy of science is about. Now, my question, and I'll really end with that, is, or maybe a tentative answer, is where exactly does he get this from? We've already seen this morning that there was a wealth of different ideological positions and philosophical theories of science within the Soviet Union. Yet Crowder claims that he derives the philosophy of the Soviet Union that holds for both science and society in Britain. So I'm very suspicious of that. The second question then is, does he pick one particular one from his friend Boris Hessen, for example, or for other good contacts that he has, or does he just spin his own one that really works for public consumption in Britain? And I tend to the latter answer, because if you look at what he stresses about the Soviet philosophy of science, it's exactly those things that will do very well in Britain. For example, and I'll end with that, particle-wave duality is so acceptable in the Soviet Union because what Crowder wants to say is we don't need to go the way Eddington, for example, is going. We have to sort of revive a certain idealist philosophy in order to accommodate quantum physics. No, you can just accept it what it is, as it is. So, no trouble with quantum physics, and you don't need to do this weird stuff that Eddington was doing. You don't need to debate evolution and its all its religious and philosophical implications. If you take the Soviet view, you can just accept it. And finally, you don't need to have a fight between pure science and applied science, as they do in Britain, or between science from the viewpoint of labor or from the viewpoint of the conservatives. Both can just go hand in hand if you take the Soviet model. So I think what Crowder's doing here, that my attentive answer is sort of create his own version of what he believes is a Soviet epistemology that he presents in order to win out. That's very much targeted at his British audience in order to win it out. That's my tentative answer. It might be very wrong, and I'd be happy to hear alternatives from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I'm working now on a book project on the history of popularization of scientific knowledge in the USSR. And so that was a very interesting kind of outsider's perspective on my subject. And I want to start with a story. 1 year before this book appeared in 1935, Pyotr Kapitsa, a famous Soviet physicist, who would later become a Nobel Prize laureate, published an article in which he complained that there is no scientific journalism, good scientific journalism in the USSR, and he was pointing his finger at Britain, saying that this is a country where the kind of state of affairs is much better. And guess whom he used as the examples? The Times and the Manchester Guardian. And so he was arguing that the kind of Soviet Union should be learning from Britain and other capitalist nations in this kind of public projection of science. And the second story that I want to share with you is that the same year when your heroes or characters were holding their conference on the public understanding of science, in 1943, an organization was founded in the Soviet Union. At that time it was called Lecturers Bureau. It was part of the Soviet Ministry of Higher Education. And 4 years later, in 1947, it would kind of mutate into a society called, later would be called Znania, a huge organization kind of designed for the propaganda of political and scientific knowledge. So in many ways, these processes kind of went hand in hand with each other, right? And in this way, I'm curious, why is your accent on Soviet in this kind of question about Soviet epistemology? Maybe we're kind of just dealing with a common experience of modernity and just two different manifestations, right? When both sides are using each other for pragmatic purposes to mobilize kind of public and state support for their kind of aims. Around the same years, the kind of folk high schools become increasingly popular in Scandinavian countries, so we have yet another example of this kind of adult education. And I'm also curious why kind of you call it epistemology when we actually deal with communication of science. and this communicational science can be used for propaganda of different epistemologies. And one good example is that in 1947, before Lysenko finally defeats all kind of supporters of genetics in the Soviet Union, that new organization in the Soviet Union was used both for the propaganda of genetics and for the propaganda of Lysenko, whatever. Like two different epistemologies, the same institute, the same kind of medium.
Right. Thank you very much. Really good anecdotes, and very, very pertinent ones at that, I think. Capital was a good friend of Prado, so it's not a coincidence at all that they would use each other that way. And I think that's exactly, as you point out, what's going on here. Crowds upholding the USSR as a model for Britain, and Kapitsa, in a sense, does it the other way around. So British science journalism is what we need here. And in both cases, what they're doing says much more about what they're trying to accomplish at home than about the thing that they're referring to, which is, of course, their sort of idealized picture of what needs to be happening at home. So I think it's kind of a mirror story of what I've been done. As to epistemology, sure, because you can use the same vehicles and institutions for promoting different epistemologies. Sure you can do that. I've just been trying to show that in the British case, there was a particular sort of political epistemology that was very much pushed through by the very curators of the profession of science journalism. But of course, there were actually, to give one other example, C.P. Snow becomes a science correspondent for Discovery magazine, I think around 1940. And he has a very different agenda, certainly not the same as Crowder. So yeah, but he probably profits from the fact that that sort of prepared a field for him, so that he can actually do such a job.
And can I add very short comment? Instead of radio, they were using lectures in the Soviet Union, so they were using a very interactive medium for the kind of spread of knowledge.
I also don't have the answer to your question. What actually is Soviet about this epistemological approach? But it seems to me that we can only come to a better understanding if we look at the state of what was called scientific philosophy, maybe in general, more general terms. I don't know the case of Crowther, but I know the case of the Cambridge Five and especially of Anthony Blunt. And for them, like the Machtergreifung by the Nazis, I think was, they were already convinced Marxists and so on, but this kind of generated much more motivation to get involved, to actually engage, because Britain had this appeasement policy, and it already was effective before 1938. So I think we also have to see the time. Yes, it's after 1933. Most of what he wrote was after 1933. So to kind of bring about kind of popular front against fascism was a kind of agenda of all left-wing writers, I think, especially in Britain. On the other hand, we need to maybe see also what exactly is this epistemology or the dialectics he is hinting at. And I think Alexander Dmitriev's talk already showed that there is no clear answer to that. It was a fight in the Soviet Union and in the ideology or in Marxist philosophy in general. But there is a strain of Marxist philosophy which always was grounded in the kind of research logic that Crowther also emphasized so much. the scientific spirit is a spirit which is enabling heresy, for example. You can put everything forward, and everybody can get involved, and all that. And such things or such statements always existed, even before. But it's shaping the history of Marxist philosophy and of the Soviet Union, that there is a fight between those who want to connect to an older heritage, which in my opinion, but I'm looking from a philosophical perspective, is the heritage of classical German idealism. So it's a Hegelian dialectics put forward by those who want to actually have a humanist understanding of the scientific heritage. Because you can see this if you contrast the statement by Crowther with, for example, statements by philosophers who have nothing at all to do with Marxism. It was Ernst Cassirer who used the very same example and the very same formulation, that the wave-particle dualism is no problem at all. It just shows the kind of dialectical approach which is inherent in science. He says for the scientists it's no problem. So he doesn't say it's for the Soviet Union at all, or for a special country. But I think he was concerned with the scientific thinking there, and he said for them it's no problem because they just deal with it pragmatically, and you can show that you, with this example, that you cannot be too dogmatic about the statements of science. You can only be, if you will, dogmatic about the method, the norms of science.
May I postpone this discussion to the panel because we are really limited time. Okay, can you
I'll just take this as a comment.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we have the last one.
A very short comment. I recently listened to a talk by Philip Cunliffe. He works in international relations, and he says that we're entirely mistaken if we go from, for example, the League of Nations with some logic to institutions like the UNESCO or like the UN, because that's inherently a sort of Western internationalism. And thinking about people like James Martin Ryle, for example, who works on Comintern or the Red Aid or all these kinds of institutions, and then we have on the other hand side the CIA-funded Congress on political freedom with Michael Polanyi, and so I'm really interested in how all these different internationalisms work out and why your protagonists, why they chose the UNESCO, which doesn't appear to be a very progressive kind of internationalism, probably.
Right, well, but by the time that this happened, so this is the 44, I think the League is already pretty dead.
Yeah.
It's International Community for Intellectual Cooperation, it's sometimes called the UNESCO avant la lettre, which it isn't really, but anyway, is done and over with. So they need something new anyway.
There is no alternative that is more...
Well, there is actually. There's the International Council of Scientific Unions, for example. That would be an alternative. No, there's the World Association of Scientific Workers. That would be different. What is the alternative? So why here? I'm not totally sure actually why they choose to embark on this, but it's probably the idea that out of the British-American cooperation will grow some international organization to replace the League. Actually, originally the United Nations meant the Allies, basically. I mean, they were called the United Nations. And I think there's a chance there. This committee of Allied Ministers of Education is very sleepy, and suddenly it gets infused a lot of energy when Needham comes in and starts to promote this as a new world cultural organization with science at the lead. So I think there's sort of smell a chance there that this is maybe an organ in which we can give our vision of a scientific society a sort of world impact. it fails pretty fast actually, but at its incipience in 1945, the science program led by Needham with Julian Huxley, the biologist, as the general direction of UNESCO, it looks for a while as if this is pretty successful. But then there's, these are complex organizations, then there's the Cold War, so pretty soon it fails. But actually, I can't completely answer your question why they picked this moment in this organization to be active in. Especially since many of the people from the social relations science movement were also very active in the International Council of Scientific Unions. So that would also have been a very good choice. Maybe an even more obvious choice. I'm not totally sure. It's a good question. Thanks.
Thank you for your questions. I will move to the